Hello, everyone. We're going to get started in just a bit. My name is Briana Roberts. I am the Forced Marriage Initiative Project Associate on our Forced Marriage Initiative team, and I will pass it over to Casey.
Thank you, Briana, and good afternoon or good morning, wherever you might be in the United States. It's really great to see so many people on and good to be in space with my colleagues, Hellitz and Bri. I am the Director of Public Policy, Casey Swegman, here at the Tahirih Justice Center. I recently stepped into this role of Public Policy Director and historically was the FMI Project Associate, the position that Bri has now, and then the FMI project manager, which is the position that Hellitz now boldly holds. And so I'm excited to sort of be part of this conversation today as someone with a background in this issue, and also just always learn something new from my colleagues who bring fresh perspectives on this work. And so, Bri, if you want to move us forward, I can give a brief overview of the Tahirih Justice Center. We are a national nonprofit that serves immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. We have been around for over 25 years, and really the bread and butter of what the Tahirih Justice Center does is free immigration legal assistance to immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. Oftentimes that looks like representing survivors for asylum cases. It also includes trafficking, so T visas, survivors of other types of crime in the United States looking to pursue a U visa, a VAWA self-petition, and other forms of immigration relief that are available to immigrant survivors. And we do this out of our 5 national offices, which are in Baltimore, Maryland, the greater DC, Virginia area, Houston, Texas, Atlanta, Georgia, and San Francisco, California. And beyond just immigration legal services, in many of our offices, you can receive family law, referrals for medical services that come with our holistic wraparound social services and interdisciplinary model. So with that, I will refocus us back on to our Forced Marriage Initiative project and our work that is national. And I think, Bri, if we go to our next slide, is this Hellitz you or this me?
Thank you, Casey. Hi, everyone. My name is Hellitz Villegas, and I manage the Forced Marriage Initiative. And as Casey shared, the Forced Marriage Initiative is a national program. We were created in 2011, really to meet a need and provide a response to the problem of forced marriage in the United States. We were receiving calls from individuals at risk, and we were referring them out, and they were coming right back. And we noticed that these individuals at risk were not getting the services that they truly needed, in large part because individuals just did not know how to provide services to them. Service providers were a little bit stumped with this type of harm. And so thank you all for being here today and for joining our training. We hope that it is helpful when you encounter someone who may be facing this type of abuse. Our program is tiny but mighty, and we are invested in research. We host outreach events like this, but also, attend conferences, trainings, developed tools, develop tip sheets. And so if you're ever in need and would like something more targeted for the services you provide, please do feel free to reach out to us. We are happy to partner, happy to work together to ensure that if you're working with someone at risk, you have the tools that you need to meet their needs. And most importantly, we do work directly with individuals at risk. And so that is the work that Briana Roberts is doing day in and day out, working directly with survivors across the nation who are facing this type of harm, survivors of all ages, of all backgrounds. And so let's dive deeper into our presentation. The definitions that you see on the screen are Tahirih's working definition for what a forced marriage is and for what it is not. At Tahirih, we define forced marriage as a marriage where one or both people do not or cannot consent to the marriage. And typically, this involves elements of force, elements of fraud, or coercion. We do not equate forced marriage with an arranged marriage process. An arranged marriage is a process in which families may take the lead, but the ultimate choice to marry remains with the individual. And we understand that though these are our working definitions, individuals at risk may not utilize this type of language. They may describe their situation as, being pushed on by parents. Maybe they utilize the words arranged marriage. And so in order for us to truly take a survivor-centered approach, it is critical that we listen and that we spot for consent. Is consent part or not of the process that is being described to us, regardless of how the situation is being named? And more really on consent, because that is key to the differences here. Consent should be across the board. And so that is a yes, the person can freely express their wishes and do not fear any sort of negative consequences. Yes, they are actually wanting to get married. So even the idea of marriage is something that they should be able to consent or not to, again, without negative consequences. Yes, they want to get married to the person that they are being introduced to. And yes, the timing is right, meaning that the timing that is being discussed is, again, a choice that the person is agreeing to. And we do see cases often where, a woman or girl tells us that they did not mind the idea of a process where their families assisted or took the lead, but they were told they could wait. They were told they could wait until they were done with college. And now the process is being moved forward and they are still in high school and they're not able to express their wishes. The family is telling them that the process must move forward now. And if we pause and think about that, it can be really jarring, really scary to think that at some point you had some control, you had choice, or you invited your family to be part of the process, but now things are moving forward out of your hands and you're not able to express your wishes. And even if you do, perhaps there are negative consequences, or you fear that there could be negative consequences, or you're just not being heard. This next graphic provided to us by Vidya Sri, a survivor who was at Harvard at the time that she created this continuum, and Darakshan Raja, who was at the Urban Institute at the time, helps us to understand how this change from an arranged marriage process can occur to a forced marriage process. But please note that although this graphic is incredibly helpful, this is not a linear process, meaning that folks don't just begin at stage 1 and then go through 2 and 3 and so on. Folks can find themselves from stage 1 and then jump all the way to 8. And again, there's ebbs and flows to how the marriage may change and how families may move forward with the pressures of the marriage. Again, highlighting here that the dismissal for consent is truly key. If a person cannot express their wishes about the entire process, again, not just about the person who they're being introduced to, the idea of marriage altogether, the timing, that is something that as advocates, we need to discuss deeper to be able to provide holistic services. And so taking it back a little bit more to how our program came to be and how we know that this is a type of harm that does exist in the United States, back in 2011, when we were getting those calls and we spotted this issue, we did conduct a national survey across the nation. And we did learn that it is a serious problem in the United States and that it's clearly being underreported. The survey, which can challenge the ideas that some of us may hold of who a victim of forced marriage looks like, received over 500 responses. Almost all states participated, and it identified as many as 3,000 known or suspected cases of forced marriage. Participants also told us that they had encountered at least one case, and folks mentioned that they knew there were hidden cases in their community, cases that were just not coming to the light, informing us that it truly is a situation that is underreported. And more findings from the survey. Who did we identify? The survey identified that victims came from at least 56 countries. It also showed us that religious backgrounds of those who were facing this harm were incredibly diverse, and it included individuals who were not facing the threat of a forced marriage with a connection to religion in any way. The majority of those named as victims were female, and throughout this webinar, we are using gendered language. This continues to be the case for those we serve. The majority of the individuals we serve are women and girls, but we do serve individuals of all backgrounds, including men and boys. And those on the survey were individuals who did not have immigration related concerns, meaning that the victims, some of the victims, included US citizens, and the weddings were occurring both in the US or abroad. And to highlight a bit more about our program, we actually provide services to individuals directly who are US citizens or lawful permanent residents, or individuals who have a lawful legal tie to the United States, meaning that immigration is not their main concern, which again can challenge some of those ideas that we may have of who is a victim or a person at risk of forced marriage. In the survey, many of the victims were under the age of 18, and our program continues to provide services to individuals of all ages. We have served individuals as young as 12 and well into their 50s. And so why do forced marriages happen? You know, this is really a loaded question, and the reality is that the answer is quite complex, because families differ and not every case is similar or the same, even if individuals are of similar background. All of us identify with a particular community that shapes our beliefs, our traditions, our values, and that is the case for those who we serve as well. Even if we are interacting with individuals of similar community, our beliefs and what's okay in one household can still differ from what is okay in another household. And so what we have tried to do with this graphic is highlight how communal and societal level factors that are present across communities act as tools of oppression, of gender inequality, of control over, female sexuality, and relate those to the individual family level triggers that are truly the case specific, the individual family specific motivation for a forced marriage to occur. As you can imagine, the individuals we serve face a broad range of coercive tactics. They fear for their community, they fear for their family, they fear and are getting pressure really from all of those that they may love. And it's very difficult to believe or to find support or even recognize that that is something that's that you are able to obtain. The emotional blackmail is something that most of the individuals that we serve share is very heavy, feeling like you are responsible for hurting your family, being told that you are ruining your siblings' chances of being married, that you are the reason why your family is being shamed, that you are the reason, if you do not go through with this marriage, why your family will not have a good reputation. That may seem like a small, type of harm when we're comparing it to perhaps death threats or physical violence, but it is incredibly challenging for those we serve to come to terms with this pressure and this emotional and mental manipulation that they are facing, especially when it is coming from their loved ones. Social ostracism is also a big coercive tactic. The fear of being isolated, the reality that if you do not go through with what your family wants, with what your community may want, you will be kicked out, you will not be welcomed, you will be out on the streets, and no one who you know and who you love will speak to you or care for you or take care of you in any way. Those are very real threats, and the reality of standing up to this type of harm, it's just not as easy as folks may think. I think it's common for us to be familiar with the economic related threats, with isolation and control. Stalking in these type of cases is a bit different, because for the most part, those who we are working with are usually surrounded by members of their community or their family. They go to church or temple with their family members or with their neighbors. They go to school with their cousins or with their siblings. And so stalking can take a little bit of a different view here, because they are always surrounded. And so those individuals have quick access to being able to report to other members of the family about anything that the person who is at risk may be doing. And so it makes it even more difficult to be able to ask for help, right? To remove yourself, because you are always around someone who may be reporting back. And in just a few slides, we will talk a bit more about stalking. Death threats are very common, physical violence as well. This can also happen to individuals that are loved ones, right? So perhaps the physical violence is not to the main person at risk, but perhaps to friends or to siblings, or maybe even the family threatening to harm each other, parents harming each other, or mom harming, themselves, or threatening that the decision that you are making is truly killing her, that it is giving her, heart problems or blood pressure problems. Again, the coercive tactics range, and they are incredibly emotionally and mentally manipulating. Casey, I'm going to pass it to you to go in deeper on the intersection of forced marriage with other forms of abuse.
Thank you, Hellitz, and thank you for that fantastic overview. And it's great to see all the people in the chat sharing where they're from and the work that they do with survivors. So grateful to you all for being here. And for us, it's really important to name that forced marriage is never happening in a silo. It is often just one experience of harm and trauma and abuse in a spectrum of harms that a person who experiences forced marriage at any age has experienced. And so it is a form of violence against women and any survivor in its own right, because when someone feels like they have no choice when it comes to marriage, you lose such a great deal of power and control over your life, over your bodily autonomy, over whether you finish your education, what kind of work you will do, where you will live, whether you will have children. But it's really important for us to name that it is not often the presenting problem that people are coming forward with. And so it's really important for us to name that for advocates who might be working on hotlines or at shelter, or at other organizations that focus on sexual assault or human trafficking or stalking or domestic violence, to be asking the right questions and screening, because it is a very different trauma history and it is a very different journey of healing. And if we don't identify it because we're not asking the right questions, then we won't be serving survivors in the holistic way that they deserve. And so I really like this quote from Debjani Roy, who was working at Manavi, which is the oldest South Asian domestic violence organization in the country out of New Jersey. And they wrote one of the earliest reports on this issue, speaking from the perspective of shelter advocates and caseworkers, that advocates speak to many women who are facing domestic violence, abuse, or sexual assault in their marriage. And only later in those conversations does it emerge that the conditions upon which they may have been married were under duress, pressure, and ultimately against their will. And so again, this is very different than someone who maybe married a chosen partner and there was abuse after the fact, because that healing journey looks different. We talk to forced marriage survivors, and a lot of the times when we're doing DV work, there's this emphasis on holding the complexity of loving the abuser, wanting the abuse to stop, and having real difficulty wanting to leave that relationship, even though you know you need to in order to be safe. In a lot of the forced marriage cases that we serve, that complexity, that love, is held for other perpetrators, perhaps parents and other family members who are engaging in the force and the coercion and the fraud, but not usually for the spouse. And that's a really important distinction to make in these cases, because in many ways, the spouse is often a stranger, someone they don't know, they've not built a relationship with. And so I'm naming this because our clients have said to us, sometimes the support groups at shelter or elsewhere don't really work for me because I don't resonate with a lot of the things that people are sharing. And so we are hopeful that by naming this dynamic for everyone here on the training today, we can all collectively do better by asking the right questions at the right time, identifying these survivors early and often, and offering them the types of supports and services that are really going to work for them. And so just to kind of drill down a little bit on the different ways in which forced marriage can intersect with other forms of harm, I think it's fairly obvious that individuals who are forced into marriage can be any age. We see marriages happening in the United States to children as well as adults. I've served survivors as young as 11 when they came to us, and our program has served individuals well into their 50s. And so all that is to say, in these cases, I have very rarely seen one where the abuse, the force, the coercion, the pressure, the emotional manipulation did not start in childhood. Threats that we will not let you go to school if you continue to refuse, being forced to not celebrate holidays with family. They had to stay in their room, not eat meals with the family, threats of being kicked out of the house if they continue to refuse, and those kinds of things, including threats of physical violence and actual physical violence occurring in childhood. And all of those things taken together in an effort to get someone to capitulate to a marriage that they don't want because they feel like they have no other choice, that's child abuse. Rape and sexual assault is important to name as both a cause and a consequence of forced marriage. We have seen cases where someone is the victim, unfortunately, of a rape or a sexual assault, and instead of getting the support that they need in those moments, the effort is in fact focused on getting them married as quickly as possible, sometimes to their own perpetrator, in order to quote unquote clean up that situation and protect the reputation of those involved. And so it follows pretty obviously that non-consensual sexual conduct and behavior, rape and sexual assault, would be the byproduct of a forced marriage, because there is that assumption of consummation and sexual intercourse and childbearing after the fact. But it's also really important to understand that if you're working with a survivor of sexual assault, it might not actually be safe for them to lean on family or community members or other relatives in that moment because of potential dynamics around forced marriage in that family. Domestic and family violence, I've touched on this and so has Hellitz, so we won't belabor that one too much, but just to say that many of those types of abuse, coercion, intimidation, and things that you see in your quote unquote typical domestic violence case are very present in our forced marriage cases. And Hellitz already touched on stalking, but that ability to use your sort of natural proximity to that person to make them feel like they never have an opportunity to reach out for help because someone is always watching them. Human trafficking, I think, is an important one to unpack a bit, because sometimes we still get the question, well, isn't forced marriage just a form of trafficking? And the answer is not often, but sometimes, because it can have elements of human trafficking in certain cases, but oftentimes the dynamics that we're seeing would not rise to the level that would meet either a state or a federal definition of human trafficking. And so that is because oftentimes we do not see exploitation or gain as the primary motivator. While there can be sort of bride prices or dowries or a relief of a debt involved, oftentimes the monetary gain or the exploitation is not the defined goal of the family, but more entrenching gender roles, bringing someone back in line to gendered expectations or religious expectations, and control over female sexuality and family ties, quite frankly, extended family ties. And so there can be some elements of human trafficking sometimes. And of course, some of our cases really do rise to that level. And some really high profile cases of human trafficking have involved elements of forced marriage, especially when we're talking about servile marriage, where there's elements of labor trafficking. And I think it is clear that some child marriage cases that are forced would in many ways fit into state-based definitions of human trafficking. But the other thing to name is that in consultation on these issues, we have heard from certain communities that labeling survivors, trafficking survivors, and labeling all of their family members and parents in particular as traffickers is doing more harm than good, because in certain instances, there is this wish to remain connected to family and community. And once those types of labels are brought in, being a trafficking survivor makes me more ostracized than not. Having my parents labeled traffickers makes me more ostracized than not. And so it's important to understand with the individual survivor that you're working with, how did they name the harm that they're experiencing and what is going to be useful to their healing journey? FGMC, we're just naming here that could be an entire presentation in and of itself, but flagging that if you have a survivor who's come forward from a community that might practice FGMC, it's important to screen for that because of the way in which FGMC and marriage are intertwined with each other. Oftentimes, female genital mutilation or cutting is part and parcel in certain communities of making someone marriageable, preparing them for marriage. And so if you have someone coming forward about FGMC, it's important to screen for forced marriage. If you have someone coming forward for forced marriage, it's important to screen for FGMC so that we can meet all of their needs and we don't miss anything.
So we often receive many questions about what does a typical case look like. So we'd like to take a moment to share with you Carla's story, and her story often reflects cases that our program gets. Before we move forward with the case example, I encourage the audience to keep in mind the following questions and imagine that Carla is someone who potentially comes across during your work. We will take the opportunity to discuss these questions at the end of the case example. So the first question is, Carla reaches out to your agency. In what ways would her case challenge the current intake process or requirements to receive services? Next is, what are Carla's strengths and assets? And then the last one is, what steps can Carla take to protect herself in the short term? Carla is 18 years old and a U.S. citizen. Her parents exercise a great deal of control over her and her siblings' lives, forbidding dating and requiring she come straight home when school lets out. Carla has a part-time job at a local store, but she must give her parents her work schedule every week and make sure she is home within a half an hour of her shift ending. Carla's parents monitor her and her siblings' computer and cell phone use very closely. Carla's parents have always told her that they would arrange her marriage, and recently they informed her they found a good match. Carla has told her parents she is not ready to get married, but her family insists that the marriage must go forward now. Her parents have told her that if she does not marry the man of their choosing, she will bring shame to the family, and that her refusal to get married is killing them, and ruining her younger sister's marriage prospects. Carla's parents have informed her that her grandmother and her uncles will be visiting soon. Carla is suspicious that wedding plans are moving forward, but knows that if she refuses or tries to leave, it could lead to escalating abuse and potentially violence in the home. In the past, Carla has witnessed an older sister being beaten by their parents after she fled from her abusive husband and tried to return to the family home. Her sister was also resistant to the marriage their parents had arranged for her, but ended up giving in to family pressure. Carla does not want to end in the same situation, but does not know how to safely resist the pressure to get married. Carla calls your organization. So based off the case scenario that we just read, Carla reaches out to your organization. In what ways would her case challenge the current intake process or requirements to receive services? Feel free to put your answers in the chat. So Elizabeth said, Carla would be eligible for services. The rush on this would change our full intake process. Also, the fact that she is younger than most of our clients would invite different responses from us than others. Okay. Rima says no challenges as we refer to Tahari. Casey and Hellitz, is there something that you want to uplift with this question?
Yeah, thank you so much, Bree. Elizabeth, I would love to better understand what kind of program you work for, if it's domestic violence, service provider, a DIA. Okay, thank you. And if you want to share with folks in the chat what type of provider DIA is, that would be incredibly helpful. I think that often when we pose this question, we encounter folks who say, she's 18. Yes, we're able to provide services. We provide services to individuals who face, family violence. But also we encounter folks who say, no, they would not be able to provide services because they provide services to individuals who are facing intimate partner violence. And I used to work at a domestic violence shelter, and I know that would have been the case for us. We would have referred out. And so that is often what I'm seeing when it comes to the difficulties with the intake process.
Thank you, Hellitz.
Oh, and I see, Valerie, you named that you deal with intimate partner violence and probably would refer to other services. And so thank you so much for naming that, because it is something that we see as a challenge. And at times when we're working with individuals who are needing shelter, Bree finds herself, making those calls and attempting to liaise, because at times the cases can really move forward very rapidly. Back to you, Bree.
Thank you. So for our next question is, what are Carla's strengths and assets? Andrea says, the fact that she has work experience and has the ability to build a support system outside of the family context. Rima says, 18 as an adult and can decide for herself at a cost though. So yeah, I agree. Her being 18 and her being able to access shelter if she needs a safe place to stay without that age limitation, as well as the part-time job and her ability to have access to financial freedom. I also want to uplift Carla's awareness of her situation and her having a gut feeling that something is happening soon. Oh, yes. And Andrea said vicarious experience for seeing what her older sister went through. Maggie, she is working and she is aware of what she wants and what she doesn't want, and also reaching out for help. I agree. We can move on to the next example, or sorry, question. What steps can Carla take to protect herself in the short term? She can seek legal help. To reach out to some services that are available. Safe house is the only option. The family will come after her otherwise. Yeah, so I would say something that she can do in the short term, because her parents are monitoring her tech usage, to really talk about tech safety with her in order so she can communicate with supportive systems safely. In terms of shelter, really assess for what Carla's capabilities are. Does she have a trusted friend, other family members? Can she access safe housing? Is that possible for her? And depending on if she's a college student, can she go into the dorm? So there might be other options versus a safe house that she can have access to. And then lastly, how would your response be different or options change if Carla were 16?
Yeah, I recognize that that last question was not included in the first slide where we were sharing the group discussion questions, and that was on purpose. I in doing this work, recognize that when we are encountering minors, that it can be incredibly difficult to provide services, and that often we may have reporting responsibilities, or maybe unsure as to how to provide future support. I saw in the chat that some programs have youth services, and that's incredibly helpful to know. And really this question is here just to get us thinking creatively and think about what sort of information do we know about the services or about the rights and options that someone who is 16 has access to? And what are your actual reporting guidelines? Has Carla named something that in your guidelines is reportable? If you must report, is there a way of attempting to have a more positive intervention with the Child Protective Services system? Are you able to provide Carla, even as a 16-year-old, the number to maybe a youth program or a youth shelter or a crisis line that serves minors? What can we leave Carla with so that at least she has some additional tools and resources to reach out for help if she were to need that support? And so we are going to talk a little bit about child marriage in just a moment, but wanting folks to think about how can we utilize the information that we know, how can we be creative and provide someone who is 16 with a resource, not telling folks to not follow their mandates, but also to provide the 16-year-old, if you are to encounter them, with those resources like what we have named. And so moving forward to child marriage, I'm going to pass it back to Casey.
Thank you, Hellitz. And we're going to be going over this issue quite briefly today and plan to have a future webinar that goes far more in depth around the challenges and creative advocacy involved when working with minors. But if we go to the next slide, I can just give a very brief overview because we would be remiss if we didn't mention it at all. So the fact is that there are still many states in the US where child marriage is perfectly legal. We at Tahereh do not claim that every single child marriage is forced in every instance. I can imagine a world in which two 17-year-olds who are mature and in love wish to get married. What I know is that I have never met those people, and that for the most part, the vast majority of child marriage cases in the US appear to involve some really concerning factors when we look at the data. And that data is that over 300,000 minors were married in the United States between 2000 and 2018. So this is not old data, and this is not a small number of people being impacted. And when we looked at that data and we broke it down by gender, the vast majority of cases involve girls marrying adult men. Some of those adult men were decades older. There were many marriages in which the age at which the minor was being married was below the age at which they could legally consent to sex in that state. And in some states that overlaps with a marriage defense to statutory rape or sexual assault, putting minors at incredibly increased risk of victimization with no protections. And in many states, the way in which you would get around the age of 18 as the minimum age for marriage is through parental consent, the consent of one or both parents standing in for the consent of the child. And as we know now, based on the cases that we work on and the survivors that have come forward, many times it is the parents themselves who are forcing or coercing the marriage. And so parental consent is really just a veil over parental coercion. The good news is that as of 2016, there has been a growing movement to end child marriage in the US. We have many of those advocates on this training today with us. And since 2016, 33 states that hadn't touched their laws in a very long time have reformed their laws to strengthen them. And in all, 8 states have actually completely ended child marriage. And there is no marriage under age 18 in those 8 states, with no exceptions to that rule. And we are hoping that that continues to grow.
Casey, before we move forward, someone in the chat asked a bit more about the map. And I know this is from our report, and I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about the map and the reports that we have on child marriage.
Yes, the map is both our best friend and our greatest enemy in that I wish it were prettier, but the green and the red and the yellow and the gray all mean something here. And so green are states where only legal adults can marry, and that includes court-emancipated minors, either 16 or 17. Green with a star, which is very hard to see on this slide, is a state that has banned all child marriage under the age of 18. Any state with an exclamation mark has absolutely no minimum age of marriage at all, and the gray and the yellow really vary. And so I would point people to tahereh.org/child marriage to dive deeper into this map and to the reports that we actually update every single year after state ledge sessions wrap, to share with everyone where your state stands on child marriage. We have statutory compilations if you really want to get deep into the weeds on what your state law actually says. We have broad overview reports, and we have actually done a recent comparison report around all of these states that have taken steps to reform their laws since 2016. How are they doing? How have the rates of child marriage been impacted by those legal changes, and what can we learn from that? So again, it's tahereh.org/child marriage, where you can find all of those reports and an in-depth analysis of what this map really means. And so, we have some pretty obvious challenges when minors are facing the threat of forced marriage. In many ways, if we all reflect on times when we were young, I really didn't have any sense of my legal rights at all, let alone rights around marriage and parental control, what parents can and can't tell you to do, right? You hear day in and day out, under my roof, you follow my rules. And in many ways, the US Constitution does grant parents those rights to decide where you go to school, to decide where you will live, to share religion with you, and have certain expectations of you as a child. But the truth is, you are not allowed to force a child into marriage. It's just a really hard area to understand, especially when you're that young and everything you're hearing is that I have to do what my parents say. Oftentimes, we have a huge lack of evidence. Often, folks just say, I just know. It happened to my cousins, it happened to my sister, it happened to my mom. This is just going to happen to me. I just know it. Or they just say it. And there isn't just a lot of hard evidence to show a judge in order to try and get a protection order or intervention from a social services agency. In many states, you lack capacity or standing to initiate court action on your own. And many times it's a parent who is supposed to be initiating court action on behalf of their children. And again, very problematic in these situations. We've seen time and time again, even when minors have been, ready to reach out to law enforcement for support and took that step, law enforcement has shown up and they have decided that what they are seeing is a hysterical child and parents who are just trying to discipline them, or parents who say, oh, she's mentally unwell, she hasn't taken her medication, and have sometimes had them involuntarily committed to psychiatric wards. And there's just this instinct to defer to parents that really works against us in many of these cases. And quite frankly, every state except for Texas, kudos to Daya for helping us with this work when we were there doing legislation. Texas is the only state where forcing a child into marriage is written into the mandates around child abuse and neglect. Every other state, you will struggle for CPS to see these types of cases in mandate. And again, on the other side, we obviously have really, really hard situations where minors just are super limited in their ability to leave home. The younger they are, the harder that is. Interfering with the care and custody of minors can be a criminal offense in some states. So even if a parent of a friend wants to help, they're putting themselves at risk. If shelters want to house minors, again, they do so at their own risk sometimes. And unfortunately, youth shelters often can only hold folks for 24 or 48 hours, and there's a report to parents that must be made. And all of this really compounds to put minors at an increased level of risk of ongoing harm, just because of all the ways in which the doors to help are really shut on them. And the system presumes that parents are there to help.
Casey, there's a question in the chat. Do you have statistics as to whether forced or child marriage happens more in rural or urban areas around the country?
That's a great question, because it allows me to say that it's actually happening everywhere. There are no firm statistics in terms of rural versus urban. We have state by state statistics, and I think they really drive home the case dynamics that we have seen over the years, which is I have served girls from Appalachia and we serve girls from New York City. We have served young people from the middle of the country, and we have served young people from Washington State and California. I have had clients who work for highly paying defense contractors in Washington, D.C., and I have served clients who live in trailers on their family's property. And so this form of gender-based violence really does not discriminate. And I wouldn't say that I have seen any particular trend in terms of that type of geo-social dynamic. I hope that answers the question. Risks and harms, and I want to drive home the point that these are risks and harms of child marriage, whether or not that marriage is forced. And so setting aside the fact that, yes, there could be certain folks who desire to be married underage, they are few and far between, and they are the exception. The fact of the matter is, whether it's consensual or not, child marriage comes with a great risk of dropping out of school, increased medical and mental health problems, a greater vulnerability to violence, huge statistics on a greater likelihood of future poverty, and marriage at an early age really doubles down on the consequences of teen pregnancy. And in one really interesting and thoughtful study, it was found that pregnant teens who do not marry, co-parent together, yes, but do not marry, fare far better on every one of these outcomes economic, education, medical, mental health, you name it, than pregnant teens who do marry. And there is upwards of an 70 to 80% divorce rate when just one party to a marriage is under the age of 18. And what we know is that marriage doubles down on the risk of future poverty and being cut off from education and resources for women and girls, more so than it does for men and boys. And so all of these things taken together lead us to the conclusion that whether forced or not, child marriage is bad public policy. And that is why we and many others in this movement, most notably survivor advocates themselves, are pushing to end child marriage in the United States. So beyond this, just thinking a little bit broadly around federal laws, and not just around age of marriage, but other things, give you a rundown of what you can share with folks in terms of rights-based education. Right now, there is no forced marriage specific criminal law at the federal level. At the state level, there are 9 states and 2 jurisdictions that do have criminal offenses of forced marriage. As far as we know, we've done a couple of rounds of research on this. These statutes have never been used in a criminal prosecution. So their effectiveness sort of yet to be proven. And there is no agreement among the national movement and the folks within the National Forced Marriage Working Group that we facilitate that a federal level criminal law would bring enough benefit to be our #1 policy goal at this time. Right now, we are focused on lots of other things, including the minimum age of marriage on the state level. Looking at the immigration system, and this is important, especially for the Tahirih Justice Center, because we are sitting at the intersection of the movement to end violence against women and gender-based violence and the movement for immigrant rights. And so we see the ways in which these 2 forms of oppression can intersect. And so right now, it's really important to know that there is no minimum age for a foreign beneficiary of a fiance or a spouse visa. You are supposed to have to be 18 to sponsor. So the US citizen or the legal permanent resident who is sponsoring the fiance or the spouse is supposed to have to be 18. But what we have seen in the data is that that isn't always the case either. There are ways around that. And there have been girls as young as 11, 12, 13, 14 brought over as fiancés and spouses of US citizens, some of which are in their 30s, 40s, and 50s. And that is an area of extreme exploitation that we are trying to address through legislation at the federal level. I will say that at the state level and at the federal level, we have lots of laws around domestic violence, child abuse, stalking, kidnapping, unlawful restraint, rape and sexual assault. And all of those things can be used as tools to protect these kinds of survivors and these victims who are coming forward. Many times there are accompanying crimes or things that can be addressed through a civil protection order that should be leveraged as tools of protection, whether or not there's a forced marriage specific tool at your disposal at that time. So we encourage folks to think creatively, identify what is really going on and what are the tools available to you. And I will also just name that we did have a big win in VAWA 2022, where we got forced marriage defined as a form of harm that is present in the United States, affecting children and adults in the Violence Against Women Act for the very first time. So this is an important piece of legislation that names what is deserving of funding, of support, of attention in this country, and to have forced marriage defined in that document now is a big deal. And so I think that's another way to share with folks that you are recognized, you are seen, and the federal government is working to try and do more to build protections and supports for these survivors.
Thank you so much, Casey. And I hope that that piece regarding the laws answers some of the questions or some of the thoughts that folks were chiming in the chat as it relates to, grantors and who you can serve. And we can certainly speak together more creatively and seeing how perhaps forced marriage being added to VAWA perhaps can support your work with survivors of this type of harm. And so I'm going to move forward with the screening and responding and hopefully continue to take questions but for the sake of time, we may have to hold on until we get to the end, as I want to ensure that we are truly covering the responding piece, right? We've learned
And
about
I'll answer this question in the chat, Hellitz, so you go right ahead.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Casey. And so I fully recognize that some of these warning signs that you will have on your screen are not things that you may know, given your proximity to the person at risk, given the work that you do. Perhaps you're a hotline advocate and you speak with someone once. But what I'm hoping that these warning signs help you to do is to perhaps dig a little bit deeper or to better spot some of the signs. And so when it comes to family history, there's some obvious points, such as having siblings who are forced to marry or who had early marriages. But something that I did want to flag, and I won't go through each point step by step for the sake of time, is a warning sign of the death of a parent, as we have seen this sign or come up several times. For some parents, ensuring that their children are taken care of is a big value, a huge responsibility. And we have seen that when someone is truly critically ill, we have seen that be a trigger for a forced marriage. We have also seen the death of a protective parent be a trigger, as that person is no longer able to provide support for their children or shield them from what the other members of the family or community may want. Looking ahead to health issues, the anxiety, depression, emotional withdrawal, every client has shared with me some sort of emotional or mental health need as a result of the pressures that they are facing. They also have faced or named, self-harm or, attempts to end their life, seeing that as the only way out or the only, honorable, in quotes, way of getting out of the situation. I'll move us to a couple of areas that may be a bit less common for folks who are not doing this work. One being when someone is accompanied by family members at all of their appointments, or they're never left alone with a health provider. Again, not being given the opportunity to share in a safe space, and so they're always surrounded by someone. That could be a warning sign to explore a little bit deeper. And another one that may seem, again, uncommon, but not so much for our work, unfortunately, is the unwanted or concealed pregnancy. We can have a lot of assumptions as to why someone may be hiding a pregnancy, but what we know from our work is that it could be a trigger for a forced marriage, even if that person has been assaulted. And so we hope that these help you in better thinking about what questions could you ask, in a survivor-centered way to better dig down and see if the person you're working with is facing this type of harm as well. When it comes to additional warning signs, such as law enforcement issues or interactions with law enforcement, we have seen family members utilize law enforcement against those individuals who are at risk. And so making them known to law enforcement, making them known as, oh, they're just a frequent runaway. They are not taking their medication. They, oh, we called you. They didn't call you. They are the ones that are acting out. And so, painting that person as someone who is truly, causing problems in the home. And so if or when the person needs to contact law enforcement, they are already known to them, and they're known to them as someone who is, again, the problem within the household, or the young person who's often just not listening to their parents. Moving forward to education or employment related issues, what we have seen in this area are sudden shifts. And so a student who perhaps was, doing great is now not doing so great. A student who is withdrawing from school, who named being excited about applying for college or applying for work, and now they're not completing, any application, or their behavior has suddenly changed. Here, a major point that may seem uncommon, but very much related to our work, is individuals fearing upcoming holidays and fearing breaks, or not being sure if they are returning from those holidays or those breaks. Often when folks are school age, during those breaks, that winter break, that spring break, that summer break, is when we see an uptake of folks making contact because they know that there's travel coming, and they fear that that travel is for, a marriage. And so pausing a little bit for us to think about, how would we ask someone if they're facing a forced marriage? Now that we've gone over some warning signs, we've gone over the definitions, we've gone over the tactics that are faced, we do have to ask, right? And so thinking about the way that we ask is truly critical. Our role is truly in prevention and healing. We do not expect anyone to be an expert in someone's culture. I myself are not an expert in my own culture, and we don't expect that of anyone on this training either. But what we do hope is that when you're working with someone who may be facing this type of harm, when you have spotted some warning signs, when you think, you have a gut feeling, gosh, I'm seeing some of these warning signs, I'm noticing the withdrawal, I do need to ask deeper, that you begin that conversation based truly on trust and respect, that you do your best to not be judgmental, that you're rooting yourself in a non-judgmental point of view about the person, about their family, about their culture, about their community, that if you can be knowledgeable about resources, right? What, who and where could you refer someone to if it's not your program? What information could you give? Could you have, our phone number, email, our website, handy in case we are a good resource for the person who you are meeting with? You could certainly educate them about rights and laws. And this is truly an important point, as you may be the only person telling them that they have a right to say no to a marriage that they do not want, or to a marriage partner that they do not want. They have a right to leave a marriage that they do not want. There's no religion that sanctions forced marriage. And for many of the individuals we work with, they haven't heard from anyone who has told them that intercourse is not an obligation, and that rape and sexual assault can occur within a marriage. These are critical educational points that are incredibly helpful for someone to hear, especially if everyone around them is pushing them to do something that they do not want, and they are feeling guilty about making a different decision. At the bottom of the screen, you see the words, remember the one chance rule. And that is a reminder to everyone that often we just have one chance to provide resources. It is beautiful when folks can make an appointment, when they can call us at a certain time, but often we have to take advantage of that one time that they're reaching out, that call that they're making to the hotline, that email that they may be sending. We do not know if they are being monitored. We do not know if they're going to be taken across state lines or across the country, or to another country for a marriage to occur. And so we want to ensure that we take advantage of the time that we have with folks and provide them with some sort of resource and connecting them. And so thinking more about how or what you actually would say in asking. For some, this may seem like a very stressful situation. I'll be honest, when I first started working in this work, I thought about this as well. Well, how would I ask? That's so personal. And the reality is that a lot of us ask about marriage or engagements all the time when we, go to work and we're in the kitchen and someone names that they are engaged. Typically, we ask, oh, how did that engagement happen? Or how long have you known your partner? Or when's the wedding? Some of these questions are not so uncommon for us to ask. And so I like to, take a moment to hopefully remove some of the stressors in thinking about how you would ask someone, because again, these questions are not so unique, and they are often ones that we may ask just a little bit differently. And so if you have spotted some warning signs and you are, feeling, that it is time to, to ask a bit further, you could certainly ask more about how has marriage taken place in their community or in their family in the past, especially if folks are clearly naming, right, that they are, that the, marriage is coming and that there is a concern there, right? And how do they feel about that for themselves, giving an opportunity for them to share about their own feelings. Do they feel they have a choice in deciding who they will marry? How is that marriage partner being selected, and who is involved in that process? That helps us to better understand, the multiple perpetrators or the multiple individuals who may be perpetrating abuse. And are they being pressured to marry someone who they do not want or who they are unsure about? As always, explaining mandatory reporting protocols before anyone discloses information is truly critical, and the best way of truly remaining survivor-centered. When you know you're working on a case that is an emergency-related forced marriage situation, meaning that, things are moving, quickly, the person is does not have a lot of time to talk, and you have asked the appropriate questions, you could certainly ask, how much time do they have to talk? That helps you to better understand how many referrals you're able to provide or how quickly you could connect them to services. Are they facing travel abroad? If they are, when? And that could be another moment to quickly connect with our program for support when it comes to travel abroad. Is the individual safe tonight? Are they safe this weekend? Are they needing services immediately? Or is this a case where they know something is coming, but it's not something that's happening, this week or this weekend, maybe if, a few months from now when they're done with school or when that summer break comes? And are they able to find a safe time to speak again? If they're not sure, connecting them to services as quickly as possible is truly needed. A survivor-centered approach is incredibly important, when we're doing this work in the movement to end, gender-based violence. Folks are experiencing pressures from all sorts of areas, pressures from community, from family. They're questioning their own identity. They're questioning their beliefs, their values. And that is incredibly difficult to process, while also thinking that perhaps there is another way. When everyone around you is pressuring you to do something, it is incredibly tough. And so it's important for us to remember that they are thinking about perhaps leaving the home and the community that they have known, or perhaps they don't want to leave at all and are needing a thought partner to help them best understand their options. They may be lacking experience. Maybe they have never been allowed to work. They may be fearing for siblings, for loved ones. They are worried at times for increased violence that could happen if they do leave. And they're certainly worried about their future. And so being ready for second thoughts is truly something that we are always ready for. It is what it would be survivor-centered, because again, these are very big decisions. We would never tell a survivor of domestic violence who left shelter and went back to to an abusive spouse that they could not come back to shelter because of that. We would understand that these decisions are tough. And so I hope that we could continue to have that understanding if you are working with someone who is facing the threat of a forced marriage. And so before I move us to our responses, I do want to just pause and take a look and see if there's anything in the chat that we may answer now, or Bree and Casey.
You muted yourself.
Thank you. Or Bree and Casey, if you'd like to go ahead and move into typical responses that we have heard from those we serve.
I think there are two good questions that we might want to pause on here. One is, can you tell us about, I think the question, Carmela, let me know if I get this wrong, but how to respond to folks when they're traveling abroad. And I think we can just name that one of our upcoming webinars is going to go really in depth on that particular topic and how to safety plan in advance and how to respond if someone is overseas and you need to work to repatriate them back to the US. Hellitz, do you have anything else to add on that one?
No, thank you so much for uplifting that question, Casey, and the upcoming webinar. We will have a webinar on travel abroad and what emergency repatriation looks like. What I'll name is that individuals who are facing travel abroad truly are those emergency, crisis type of situations, because help is so incredibly limited. And often we do need to provide extensive safety planning before, during, after travel, and liaise at times with embassies and consulates for support, if that support is even available. And so I'm happy to talk further, especially if you are working with someone who may be flagging this for you. Happy to take that on and for you not to wait for the webinar if that is needed.
Yes, and then there was just a final question of if we, and I'm going to add others, have thought about ways in which to engage with families, and especially for victims who aren't comfortable disobeying or leaving their own family, or for whom leaving could potentially be fatal, regardless of supports in place. And I think, as ever, we want to be honest about who we are as an organization. And that is not one that is community-based. It is not one that is grassroots. And we don't put ourselves out there as an organization or as caseworkers who could intervene at the family or community level. But we do have some really key partners in that work. In and around our 5 main office areas, but also elsewhere in the country. And so if that is the kind of thing that a survivor names as important or critical or useful to them, we usually do a warm referral to those organizations that do that work, have built that expertise and that trust, because doing that kind of intervention work takes a lot of trust and deep knowledge of the communities that you are working in. And that is not where Tahere sits, but it is where many of our closely held partners sit. So if that is what ultimately the survivor determines they want, then we would make a referral to those organizations.
Thank you, Casey. And I'll just rename the importance of that being what the survivor wants. And I'm naming that again because we have seen, unfortunately, many cases where mediation or an intervention with the family has led to the forced marriage being, rushed, or individuals, especially younger folks, being taken, out of the country quickly to avoid getting involved with, other systems, or the individual now feeling like they have, shared family business, and now things are worse. And so I do think it's very critical to be honest about what is it that the individual may want, and if that is not the type of intervention that they think is helpful for their family, to then find ways of providing them the support that they are looking for. And so I'm going to go ahead and move us forward. And Bree, I'm going to pass it to you to go over this response, a typical response that we unfortunately have heard from those we serve.
Thank you, Hellitz. So the first response scenario is, Carla has just called your organization. You feel heartbroken about her situation. You tell a coworker that had Carla been raised in a different culture, she would not have been subjected to such a devastating fate. You tell your coworker that there is little that you can do since the practice is so culturally ingrained, and that many women, in fact, do not even mind. If you tell Carla to disobey her parents, it would be culturally insensitive because this is just how it's done in some cultures. Your coworker nods her head and chimes in. We don't want to be racist. It's better not to get involved in family matters. And then I'll pass it to Casey in order to explain the scenario a little bit better.
Thank you, Bree. And I think if we were in person, what we would do in this moment is ask folks to say, what do you think about this? How is this landing for you? I'd love for people to put into the chat what they spot in this answer that is or isn't helpful. And I'll give just 1 minute in the interest of time, and then we can unpack a few things and move to the next one. Yes, Summer shares it's judgmental. I would agree with that. Even if it doesn't intend to be, that is definitely how it's going to land for Carla. Feels like discrimination to me, refusal to acknowledge power and control, not providing support. Elizabeth, thank you for sharing that. And I think one of the things that I usually share about this response is that it is actually the racist response to assume that women do not, in fact, even mind in a particular culture. In fact, most individuals that we work with are coming from communities where most people aren't doing these things, right? So it is the racist assumption to assume that everyone is doing it and everyone doesn't mind. This person is coming to you saying that they mind, wanting help to claim their rights and their safety, and to dismiss it in that way is in fact the racist and judgmental and xenophobic response. Anything else that lands for folks here that you wanted to share? I think the other thing to name here is just that if a survivor hears this, the likelihood that they'll ever share with anyone else again is probably pretty low. A lot of times, folks feel very shut down by responses like this, calling it a family matter, a cultural issue. Well, it happens in all cultures. It happens from families across the United States. And so whose culture are we talking about here? And so we try and be very, very careful about the way in which we respond, but with our body language, our facial expressions, and the words that we use to open up more dialogue and not be judgmental versus a response like this, which I think, could be well-intended, but it's definitely going to do more harm than good. Exactly. It takes work to unpack the attitudes that lead to this kind of xenophobia and racism, and it's important to make time for that systematically in organizations. So it doesn't need to be done during a response to a crisis call. That's exactly right. Thank you. So I think we'll go to the next one just for the sake of time. Go ahead, Bree.
Carla breaks down crying during the call and asks for your opinion. Fighting back your own tears, you tell her, you are the same age as my own daughter. I want the same things for you that she has. You have the right to date anyone you like, get to know them, and explore your relationship emotionally and physically. Marriage, if you choose to even get married, should be your decision and your decision alone. If your parents can't agree with that, then I'm sorry, but that's their loss, not yours.
Thank you, Bree. And here I would ask the same question. Any improvements between this response and the last one? Is this one landing as helpful or more harmful? What do you spot in this response? Exactly. Thank you, Summer. It's not about what the other person wants. It's about what Carla wants. Elizabeth, it feels different, but still far from optimal. Projecting and not seeing the client. Masume, I hope I'm saying your name right. That is a really good point. And I think I'll kind of take that thread a little bit and share that, yes, I think it's somewhat of an improvement from the former response. But again, this person is centering themselves and their response and what they would want, not centering the survivor and how they might be feeling. And so we have lots of clients who don't want a forced marriage. but aren't necessarily on board with these very American and westernized versions of dating and marriage. They want something of their own, something that they define for themselves. So pushing them to explore a relationship physically prior to marriage might not actually be what they want or what they're comfortable with or what their values lead them to do. I will also name here that saying that if your parents can't agree, and the presumption here being that you lose your relationship with your parents, that it's their loss and not yours, is incredibly dismissive of the trauma of estrangement, of losing contact with your family and your parents, especially if you feel like you're in a marginalized culture where who will be your family, who will be your community if you are no longer in touch with your parents. That is incredibly minimizing of the pain of this situation. Yes, and I think it's important what Elizabeth shared, the caller could have sexual trauma, and talking about exploring something physical could be a trigger, exactly. And so these wishes that this person has have really nothing to do with what the survivor has shared they want. And again, I like that word projecting that someone used earlier. Bree, you can go ahead and read.
Sorry. Carla tells you that she is considering going through with the marriage and asks what she should do. You take a deep breath and tell her, Carla, I can't imagine how difficult this must be for you. It took a lot of strength to open up about all of this today. I, along with our entire team, are here to support you in whatever you think is best. I want to share some resources with you that may also help and provide information on some of the options you may have. So far, what or who has helped you through this or been a source of support?
Thank you, Bree. And this might be a spoiler alert, but this is the final scenario that we're going to talk through today. So if you want to share in the chat what's sort of landing for you here, pros and cons of this potential response, I'd love to hear those. And then I'll hand it back to Hellitz to wrap us up. Giving her more than one option for support. Yes, exactly. There are many different roads to healing and safety. Yes, this is the person who should be training others what to say. Thank you, Colleen. And her name is Noof, and she is available for training. She's also a close friend and colleague of ours. Summer, would prefer they ask for permission to share resources than I want to. That's a really good point. Because some people might not be ready to talk about that. Maybe they just wanted to finally share what's going on and need a little time before they talk about options. Thank you. I will also say with this response, I love the opportunity to talk about who or what has been helpful. So you get to explore sort of the self-care and the supports that have been working for this person already, and then name that those are incredible strengths as well, on top of the courage to share and reach out and to have that trust, but also to just go ahead and assume that they have been coping and they have been figuring out how to take care of themselves for a long time without you, and getting them to name those things and validating them is really powerful. Empowering, maybe the first person to tell Carla it's her choice. This response is supportive and letting her know she will still get help with what she needs, and appreciating the deep breath. Yes. Hellitz or Bree, did you have anything else you wanted to add here?
Thank you, Casey. I think this is the type of response that when I was starting off as a hotline advocate, I would love to, I have cut out and have, right in front of my computer to help me remember, the steps to take to try and be as empathetic and survivor-centered as possible. I say that because for those of us who've been doing this work for a long time, it may be easier, right, to jump into this thought regarding providing, asking for permission, and all those pieces. But if your colleagues, maybe are new to this work, or you're wanting to share more about how to be more survivor-centered on a call, if you are working on a hotline or are in a program that is taking crisis calls, this could be a great way to have a better roadmap. Yeah. And so thank you everyone for your participation, for the chats. I love to see the engagement. And so I am going to move us along, and I know that we are at time, but certainly we'll stay back to answer questions. We are here to help. We are here to be of support, whether you're needing or wanting to refer someone. Perhaps you do not have consent to refer someone, but you would like your own support in working with a survivor without, sharing more about them. Feel free to reach out to us. The email that you see on the screen just goes to our team. The phone number that you see is actually Briana's direct line. And we do have our own, website where you can find recorded materials and our toolkit, and, you name it, it is in there. I named it earlier, but we do have an upcoming training in August around the same time as today, specifically on forced travel and emergency repatriation. Here, we will walk through what actually happens if you are working with someone who is forced to travel and is needing that emergency support, particularly when you are liaising with the U.S. government. And so we are certainly excited to share our lessons learned from the cases that we have worked on, and hopes that you will share when you receive the recording, the PDF, and more information about this training. And so I'll pause here. I know that we are at time and that Casey did have to hop off, but Briana, is there any question that we have not touched on, or if folks are still on and you would like to uplift any comments or questions, we're happy to hang back to take care of those.
Yes, so one question, and I'm not sure if we got to it, but wouldn't someone or an organization be legally liable in some states if you assist someone under 18 leaving their parental home?
Thank you so much for raising that question. I believe we touched upon this question, and that Casey did add maybe comment in the chat, but I could be wrong. I will say that throughout our presentation, and when we're naming providing support to individuals of all ages, we did not name assisting someone running away or leaving home. We are very careful in providing support. We do explain rights and options, which I think is something that everyone can do. We explain what happens if they were to run away. We explain the potential harms and provide information to resources like youth shelters or safe places where they could go to, that's if that is what they are planning to do. Every state is different, is the beauty and the curse of our nation. And so some states do have greater protections for individuals who are helping minors. Some states actually allow minors to self-help with a protection order, going into a domestic violence shelter themselves. Some minors are able to seek those type of remedies, and others do not have those options. And so knowing a bit more about what is possible in your state is incredibly helpful. If you don't have the capacity to do all that research, feel free to refer to us if you're working with someone, or at least be able to provide our number, our line, or know what are your youth shelter providers and what services could they offer someone if you are to encounter that situation. Bree, did we have anything else?
No, that was it.
Okay, great. And I think the other one that was on there, the Q&A, which was related to intimate partner violence and individuals perhaps not fitting within scope of services. I believe we touched upon this, especially when we got to the piece relating to the laws and Casey naming VAWA and how VAWA now includes forced marriage as a type of harm that does occur with domestic violence, stalking, or other forms of gender-based violence. But I'll name that there are some service providers that do not provide services to individuals who are facing family violence. They may be specifically providing services to intimate partner violence. And so thinking about those who are in relationships like, husband and wife, dating partners, husband to husband, you name it, right? And so for many of the individuals who we're working with, they are facing family violence, especially if they know the marriage is coming, it hasn't happened yet. And so when we are attempting to provide them with resources and connections, it is important for us to know if the referral that we're giving is a place that is able to provide services to family violence, or do they only provide services to intimate partner violence. And if that is the only provider, then we will do our best to be able to liaise with that organization, explain how the future fear that this person is facing, what they are attempting to prevent, would be intimate partner violence, in thinking about the potential for that domestic violence or the sexual assault that could occur within the forced marriage. And so I hope that answers that question. I'm not seeing others that we haven't touched upon. So I'll just wait just like one more minute. And if we don't see any more, then I thank everyone for being here today. Thank you so much for the engagement. Thank you so much for your time. We are always happy to chat further. If you'd like to discuss a case one-on-one, if you'd like more support for your organization, we also host trainings for specific agencies, for specific providers, hotline advocates, health providers, law enforcement. We are happy to be of support in whatever way makes it easiest for individuals who are facing this sort of threat to access the services that they deserve. Again, we thank you so much for your time, and we hope to see you on our August training. Take care. Bye-bye. All right, everyone. Thank you again so much. If you could end the webinar. Thanks everyone for participating. Bye-bye.